When I was 19 years old and I first got into my head that I would seriously start trying to write my first fiction novel with intentions to publish it, I didn't think that 8 years later I would still be trying. But that's genuinely how long it took for me to finally hit my stride as a writer. I struggled for years, but recently a lot of things finally clicked for me, and I developed a writing workflow that had me churning out 1 to 2 chapters a week, polished enough to my high standards that I was posting these chapters online as part of a public writing competition. I also really healed my relationship with writing back to a place where I don't feel so lost and hopeless about my novel anymore, and I'm actually having so much fun writing. So to save you the years of frustration, confusion, and uncertainty that I suffered through and wasted, here are the 8 lessons I learned about novel writing that I wish I'd known sooner, that I wish someone else had told me instead. Lesson number 1. Nobody can help you. You have to help yourself. When I first started out, I wanted to educate myself as much as possible, so I studied everything. The hero's journey, Save the Cat, every YouTube video on every channel about writing, every post on every blog, every episode on every podcast, every craft book, the popular ones and the obscure ones. I studied books and talks by all sorts of published fiction writers. I learned every story structure. And I learned about screenwriting and storytelling for film and TV. I even investigated writing without conflict. And every time I studied and learned something new, I would apply whatever that new thing was to my current writing project. And after seeing so much of these resources, of course they're going to start contradicting each other. So even with everything I knew, I was still hesitant and uncertain about my writing. I hadn't even drafted past Act 1 of my story. This problem was at its absolute peak during the COVID lockdowns, where day after day I would open up my writing project and work on it. But really what that looked like was me opening the Word documents, but also opening YouTube and blogs and podcasts to see what new thing everybody had to say today. I was still waiting for someone to say something specific enough to save me and my story. But how could they? I'm the only one who knows the story I'm trying to tell. And other people can talk about how they wrote their own stories, but that doesn't mean it will be the way it happens for you. I was at a point where anything I needed to know, I had to find out for myself. Because what I was really looking for was a methodology, not general theories or opinions about what the individual elements of a story are. In the same way that cooking isn't about just knowing the ingredients and the tools, you need directions. People are always wanting to know how to write a novel step by step, but obviously the steps are you plan, which is like the brainstorming and the outlining, then you draft, which is where you write the prose, and then you edit, where you revise your draft. But just how drawing tutorials that will simply tell you to start with the basic shapes and then add all the details. These steps don't tell you how to think so that you can draw what you're actually imagining inside of your head. And while I did eventually find what I was looking for, it wasn't handed to me by someone else. It wasn't ready-made and sitting somewhere, there for the taking like treasure in a cave. I had to find it by conducting experiments on myself and my work. So the reason I say that nobody can help you is this. People are different from each other. Writers are different from each other. People write for different reasons. And different writers want different things, so they need different things. When people give advice in an asynchronous format and a non-personalized way, like on YouTube, for example, they have to make a number of assumptions about you and your situation and what you're trying to achieve. If their assumptions don't track or match up with you, then their advice isn't going to apply. Just because someone posts advice publicly and openly to the internet doesn't mean that they are talking to you, specifically you. You've probably seen people embarrass themselves in the comment section of every platform, where you can see that they're nitpicking and nuancing to death what the original poster was talking about. But if you could have read between the lines of what the original poster was saying, you can tell that they weren't talking to this commenter situation. They could have just ignored what they were saying. When it comes to writing advice from the internet and from craft books, a lot of it is about producing a manuscript for the purposes of querying to agents in traditional publishing, or for self-publishing as an indie author. And of course, when I first wanted to write a novel, I also thought that my end goal would be to eventually have it published. But the more that I learned about book markets and the publishing industry as a business, the less interested I became in selling a book. When I write, the most important thing to me is that I'm telling the story true to the vision I have of it. What I really want is just for all the collected chapters of my story to exist somewhere outside of me. What I'm really seeking is a true and accurate expression of my creativity. I don't know that I care about becoming famous or making a living from my writing, which I do know is such a difficult path, and I have nothing but respect for the people who choose to walk that path, even though I think it's not for me personally. I'm also really grateful to the people from the publishing industry, the agents, the editors, and the other published authors who are sharing their advice and personal experiences on the internet. It's really generous, and I think they really are helping a lot of people. But the story I want to tell isn't in the genre or the style that the advice givers I've seen write it. I have a lot of my own ideas about what a story is and how it should be. For example, I don't think a story is a philosophical debate or about internal conflict. Even though I don't think these perspectives are wrong, I just have my own way of thinking that emphasizes what I personally like and enjoy and look for when I'm reading stories. I'm not going to write something that I wouldn't even read. I think this is also related to why people will say there are no formulas to writing. I actually disagree. There are formulas, they just don't produce something that is what you're trying to create. I actually had to develop my own formula because nothing else was working for me. And maybe that's why you have to do too. So the essence of lesson 1 is to be judicious about how you're taking writing advice. Where is the advice leading you? And is it actually the place that you want to go? Once you've heard it all to the point where you're not hearing anything new, enough is enough. Start trying to find your own way. Start helping yourself. Lesson number 2. Thinking isn't writing. It's impossible to write your novel in your head. I happen to be a very cerebral person who's mostly inside of my own head. When I think, I'm basically hearing my own voice talk back to me inside of my brain. Apparently not everybody is like this, and some people think in images and impressions. But for me, when I write, I think of what I'm going to write first, before I put the words on the page. If the thought itself is incomplete or not up to standard, I don't even write it down. Turns out, this is one of the biggest, most time-wasting mistakes I could make, and it's so important that I actually made it the first video on my channel. Thinking isn't writing. It's the mantra I have to chant to myself so I can notice when I'm doing it. And I notice it the most when I'm trying to come up with what should happen next in my story. So I especially have to remind myself of this when I'm working on the middle. Thinking isn't writing. Writing a novel doesn't mean thinking about how the events unfold, this beat, that plot point, crafting them inside of your mind, and then making a record of your thoughts by putting them on the page. Thinking and writing are two different psychological processes. And one of the hardest limits of thinking is that the more you think, the harder it is for you to think of anything new. This is why you're not going to write your novel in your head. You can watch the video I already made on this, but to give the severely abridged version, in neuropsychology, synaptic plasticity tells us that neurons that fire together are wired together. If you're trying to think of what should happen next in your story and you're playing out the scenario in your head like a movie, but you can't seem to think past a certain point, your brain is going to keep leading you to the same useless dead-end ideas that you've already decided don't work. You can't think of anything new. Mood boards and music aren't inspiring anything new either, and you might start to feel like you're going insane from how much you're thinking of the problem but making no headway to a solution. At least that's how it felt like for me. I wasted a lot of time assuming I could think my way out. These days, though, I just write everything down, no matter how fleeting or subpar I judge the thought to be. Because constructing sentences outside of your brain is essential writing practice anyway. And after I've written my thoughts down, my brain will stop trying to serve it up to me as a potential solution because I've proved that I've already considered it, so it's time to give me something new. When I'm sat down for a writing session and I notice that I'm only firing my neurons about the problem but not putting any words on the page, I remind myself that thinking isn't writing, and I ask, am I a thinker or a writer? Write it down. Lesson number 3, planning becomes procrastination. With my first writing project, I fussed over my outlines like crazy. I made so many tables for each story structure, and then I kept making them and remaking them every time I studied like a new writing structure, a new story structure, a new writing theory. I thought that if I could outline everything in advance, I could have a smooth and easy time drafting, and that I could save some time having to redraft and make multiple rounds of revisions. I thought I just needed like a good, solid plan. My first writing project was a sci-fi story with a mystery plot that would unfold in a non-linear way. So I thought I was justified, even like uniquely justified, that I was spending so much time planning. But of course I wasn't. I was actually just using planning as an excuse and as a form of procrastination. I was afraid to draft. I was afraid to actually write my story because I wanted a positive emotional experience of writing. I didn't want to feel stuck and uncertain and stupid because I was supposed to be good at writing. But a novel isn't similar to taking an exam where there's a curriculum and a syllabus that you can completely study in advance so that nothing you ever face will challenge you or surprise you. Writing a novel is not like that. Sometimes the only way to arrive at a solution to whatever you're stuck in with your writing project is to write and find out. So now I pay a lot of attention to how much time I spend outlining. And when I'm outlining my next chapter, I remind myself that the plan doesn't have to be complete for me to start writing. I give myself a time limit of something like 1 or 2 days or 1 or 2 writing sessions before I make myself draft with whatever outline I've got. I've embraced discovery writing as part of my process too, and I've combined that with my meticulous outlines now, so I have a combination of both these things. And writing without an outline has become exciting in its own way too. Lesson number 4. Perfectionism doesn't cause writer's block. Now in the last lesson, I was literally talking about how I was procrastinating writing my draft because I was working on my plans and I wanted certainty. So in that process, I definitely did consider the possibility that I had to cure my perfectionism in order to overcome that writer's block and make progress with my project. Because if my standards weren't so high, then I would just be free to put whatever words I could on the page, right? I wouldn't have writer's block. But I really resisted the idea of fixing or curing my perfectionism. I really didn't want to give it up. My high standards are so important to me. It's one of the reasons I write in the first place. Nobody else was serving up the stories I wanted to read, so I thought I would do it myself. And that was my revelation. Perfectionism and high standards weren't blocking me from writing. They were actually what motivated me to write. How else could I go on for 8 years, banging my head against a brick wall with so little progress, day in and day out, where it would have probably been a good idea for me to just give up? But I kept going because that's how much I cared about the story that was possessing me. And it was more than that, I just wanted it so badly. I felt I had a responsibility to write. So perfectionism was driving me, not blocking me from writing. And I guess it's kind of obvious that perfectionism doesn't cause writer's block because even writers who aren't perfectionists get writer's block too. I found what was really blocking me from writing was negative emotions. In my case, it was fear. Fear of feeling stupid and fear of wasting time. I've already made videos about writer's block and perfectionism if you want to hear more details, but it turns out that writing, at least for me, has been a lot about emotional and psychological awareness and management. And I won't say that I'm no longer scared of wasting time and feeling stupid. I mean, if you look at my YouTube channel, you can tell that I'm going through another kind of beginner's hell with content creation. But even with those high standards, I can still get a hold of myself and write in spite of the fear that I feel. Lesson number 5. The tools of analysis are not the tools of construction. When I first started out, I was a very confident beginner. But I can admit now that it might actually be more accurate to say that I was a very arrogant beginner. Basically, my whole life, in and out of school, I was getting praise and compliments from teachers and peers about my writing. And even when that writing became less creative writing and more analytical writing, I was really strong in that too. And I thought because I was so strong at critique and I could go on and on about themes and characters and foreshadowing and subplots, I assumed that I already had everything I needed to write exactly the story I was envisioning. But obviously, after 8 years, I was clearly wrong. But why? Why was it so hard? I spent a lot of time in various different fields during those 8 years, and that led me to realize that the tools of construction are not the tools of analysis. The skill of construction is not the skill of analysis. They are different skills. Practicing and honing one skill isn't going to directly and equivalently transfer to the other. Like how you might be able to completely understand other people conversing in a foreign language, and your listening comprehension might be complete and thorough. But if those people started trying to talk to you, you might have a hard time trying to recall the vocabulary or conjugate the verbs, and you couldn't construct and speak aloud a sentence to express yourself. Expression is its own skill. Critique and creation are different things. So knowing this, I lowered my expectations that I had of myself as a writer. And even though I didn't lower my standards, this much was enough that my clumsy efforts didn't disappoint me anymore. And even though I can see so many things that are wrong with my early drafts, I understand that it's developmentally appropriate, and I actually find it quite charming that it turned out in a really imperfect kind of way. I get excited that I can refine and polish this really rough-hewn stone. I also make sure that I'm working with the materials of the craft, which are words and sentences. I make sure that I'm writing prose and not just adding dot points to a worksheet or a template, because that's not honing your skills in construction. Lesson number 6 is forget about the reader. I held myself in my writing to such a high standard because it's really important to me to make things good for the reader. I hesitated a lot, trying not to make a wrong move. But what I actually needed to do to overcome the hesitance I was experiencing was to forget about any reader. A lot of writing advice is about what the reader wants or thinks or expects. And I mentioned earlier that this is because a lot of writing advisors are assuming that you are going to want to sell your novel. So, of course, you should be conscious of what the reader wants, since it's ultimately the reader that is going to give you money for your story, if you're selling it. But if you have no first draft of your story, you have no reader. Knowing about so many mistakes and so many don'ts in writing is only paralyzing. Do you think that animals in training or children or new employees are going to be able to figure out and do the right things if the only things they hear all day long are what they shouldn't do? Now when I write, I never mind the reader. When I edit, I'll think of the reader, but not when I write. Thinking about the reader isn't going to help you write. It'll help you edit if you're selling your novel. And even then, sometimes you, the writer, are the only reader. Don't get so far ahead of yourself that you lose sight of writing, which is the real task at hand. Lesson number 7 is that you need a strong reason to write. I thought I really wanted to write, and I thought I wanted it so bad that it would eventually happen for me. But there are stronger things in life than the desire to write, even if you do love the game. There's other spheres of life. There's your material and financial security. There's your physical and emotional health. There's your relationships with friends and family. And there's negative emotions that you are going to have to face when you write. You'll grapple with fear and frustration and disappointment. And maybe worst of all, there's the time and the energy you have to invest when you're writing a novel. Writing is so costly. Your life could pass you by. I think this is why people are so desperate to know how to write their novel in 3 months or 30 days or speed everything up with ChatGPT. They know writing could be a waste of time, and they know that writing's not really a good idea for how to spend your time. But if you do have a strong reason, you could go out on a limb and stake the precious and limited hours of your life spending them writing a novel. So I'm not caught off guard by the times when I'm discouraged or preoccupied or distracted and pulled away from my writing. I understand that that's very normal, because even though writing is so much fun, it isn't trivial. Writing is very serious business. Lesson number 8. Writing is easy when you know how to do it. After struggling for a long time, I thought writing would always be torturous. I thought I would always be hunched over my notebooks and documents, plinking out the words like water droplets out of a leaky faucet. I thought there would only ever be frustration and struggle now. And what I remember about creative writing from my childhood, the fun and the ease, when I was filling up the blank pages of my spare exercise books from the end of the school year, and words and paragraphs were just pouring out of my pen, and my handwriting was getting more and more haphazard with how fast everything was coming to me that I could barely keep up when I was writing it down. I thought writing a novel was going to feel like that ever again. That the magical time of back then was over and writing was all about suffering now. I thought maybe I was too stupid to understand because all the help and the resources at my fingertips wasn't enough for me, and I became convinced that I couldn't do it. But the reason why I couldn't do it wasn't because there was something wrong with me. I just literally didn't know how. I didn't know a methodology for writing. And in the 8 years I spent trying, I was doing a lot of other things. I learned and experienced many things in other fields, like teaching and education and psychology and software development, on top of my academic background in art history and philosophy. This might be a story for another time, but I was moved to try my hand at an online web novel contest, and the conditions I was operating under in order to meet the contest requirements were the perfect crucible for me to bring to bear everything I'd accumulated in pursuit of my dream novel. And in those few months, I was like a mad scientist, conducting experiments on myself and my work, grappling with the words and the sentences on the page, testing frameworks of thinking this way and that. And even though I ultimately failed to meet the contest requirements, I was so happy. And I am so happy because I finally found what I had spent 8 years looking for, or I guess I'd invented it, using everything I knew. It was a step-by-step methodology for writing my dream novel. It wasn't a story structure that would tell me what was supposed to happen next, but it was a way to think and steps to take that consistently produces satisfying chapters for a reader and satisfying writing experience for the writer. And I'm not mad that finding my way took 8 years. I actually don't think I could have done it any faster. And I'm a completely different person now. I'm 27 years old. I'm glad I started young, actually, as young as 19 is anyway. And I don't consider all the thousands upon thousands of words that I've written a waste of time. Because in the end, I love the game. I love writing. And I have to write the stories in my heart. And I also think that I have to make a channel of videos that I would send back to my 19-year-old self and be the teacher and the resource that I wish I had back then. There's a lot more I could say, and I'm probably going to spend this channel saying it, but that's all for now. If you listened all the way to the end, it was an honor. Until next time.